In this lesson, we're going to talk about what it takes to be a compassionate writer. The reason is one of the learning targets within AP Language and Composition is that you are able to explain how an author uses persuasive appeals appropriate to a specific audience's beliefs, values, and needs. So what does that have to do with compassion? Well, let's look at a definition, or the objective, I guess, that's been set out by our school. Learners will demonstrate their understanding of the complexities of cultures and global issues and see viewpoints beyond their own in order to positively impact the world around them. So if we look at this part, see viewpoints beyond their own, that's a really important part of being a writer. When we are going to write persuasively, if we are going to talk in a delicate rhetorical situation, there's a lot of things we need to think about, and one of the things is understanding the viewpoint and perspective of our audience. So we're kind of talking about how we can apply writing to this idea of recognizing your own perspectives as well as the values of others. And we're going to really kind of zero in on this idea of values. So when we're talking about being a compassionate writer, our primary goal is to look at an audience to see what do they value, and writing in a way that's compassionate to those values. So this is just kind of a list, and there's a list attached to your assignment that has different values that people have. So for me, when I think of value, the definition I have over on the left is those are your priorities. For me, my priorities are creativity, family, and education. Those three have been priorities throughout my entire life and still are to this day. Now, values are different between different people, different between different groups, and different even at different stages of your life. But they're also something that kind of unifies and brings people together. So, for example, when I polled the class, we talked about how there was a shared value of family as well as friends. Those were two things that many people in the class valued. So for me, if I were to try and be compassionate about that, those are things that I would concern myself with. So for example, if I'm going to come at you with an assignment that you need to spend 2 hours on every single night, that's a huge ask. And being compassionate of that, I should consider what you value. Time with your family, time with your friends. So if I'm in a situation where I have to require something unpleasant like that, I'm probably going to address that value or need in my audience. So for example, I might say, hey guys, I know that you want to spend time with your family and friends, and that's really important to you, and I understand that. But we have to get these 2 hours in, blah, 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 blah. Essentially what I've done is I've looked at my audience, figured out what they value, what they need, and kind of used that in how I approach getting at what I want or at achieving my purpose. So some careers where being able to do this or being a compassionate writer are really important would definitely be anything in public relations, marketing, journalism. But I think the best example is in politics. In politics, you have to be so careful about what you say, and sometimes you're put in positions where you have to breach really delicate subjects. So I thought we'd look at an example of that and figure out how this was an example of compassionate writing. So let's start with some context. We're going to look at a few paragraphs from a speech that President Biden gave in the summer of 2021 at the 100-year commemoration of what's known as the Tulsa Massacre that happened in 1921. So to kind of provide the background on the historical event, the Tulsa Massacre itself, the exigence was the exigence of this massacre was the accusation of Dick Rowland. He was a 17-year-old black man who was accused of assaulting a young white woman and was put on trial for it. Knowing it's 1921, you can imagine the contextual tension that would create in a community where Jim Crow is prevalent and universal, unfortunately. So what happened is a group of white men decided that they were going to come to the courthouse, and essentially their plan was to kill and lynch Dick Rowland as he came out of the courthouse. However, there was a counter group of black men who were there to protect him. As you can imagine, that led to violence. There were gunshots. There was beatings between the two groups, but it was eventually resolved enough to kind of dissipate and move onward. But unfortunately, later, there was this same mob of white men destroyed what was known as the Greenwood District. Another word for the Greenwood District was, see if I can write it here, was Black Wall Street. And that name was given colloquially because it was an area where very successful African Americans had kind of built a really strong community among themselves, where there was hospitals, where there were schools with teachers and lawyers and doctors, and it was just an affluent middle-class area that unfortunately was uncommon at the time. So in response to the riot that had happened earlier, this mob of white men came through and completely destroyed the Greenwood District, burning it, tearing things down. 1,000 people were left homeless. Multiple people were killed. And it's just kind of a stain on American history for sure. But it's something that at the time was horrific, is still horrific today, but isn't really talked about too much. So fast forward to 2021, and it is the 100-year anniversary, and they were having this commemoration event, and Biden is asked to attend, and he's actually the first sitting American president to not only attend, but to really acknowledge the events of the Tulsa Massacre. So his audience is made up of a few survivors. Granted, they are elderly at this point, but there are survivors. They're family members in consequent generations. There are advocates for different racial inequalities and causes. And then there's just kind of the general grouping of people who've been affected by this event from 100 years ago. So when we talk about compassionate writing, I think this is a great example of someone kind of walking into what I would call a very delicate situation. For example, Joe Biden is a white man who comes from relative privilege in comparison, and because of that, speaking at a group that has never been heard or seen before in a lot of ways could be quite intimidating, and that's why they pay the speech writers the big bucks, because it's about carefully choosing words and being compassionate towards that audience. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it and kind of explain how he's addressing the values of the audience to give you an example of what compassionate writing can look like. So beginning my reading over here at the very beginning. The events we speak of today took place 100 years ago, and yet I'm the first president in 100 years ever to come to Tulsa. I say that not as a compliment about me. It is in this ground to acknowledge the truth, what took place here. For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, and so grievous, they can't be buried no matter how hard people try. And so it is here, and so it is here only. Only with the truth can come healing, justice, and repair. Only with the truth facing it. But that isn't enough. So if we pause here and look at just this paragraph, I think there's a few values that are pretty obvious. He appeals to this group's need for justice, for sure, mentioning the fact that while it's been kept secret, or not really kept secret, but while it hasn't been discussed the way other national tragedies have, that he says it isn't enough even to just talk about it, that we have to do more. I would also say he talks about truth and kind of appeals to their desire or value of the truth being out there. So those are kind of the two values that I'm already seeing that Biden recognizes in his audience. In other words, he sees that truth and justice are important to them, and so he's kind of making subtle nods to that in the first paragraph. Let's read the next one. First, we have to see, hear, and give respect to Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, and Mr. Van Ellis, and to all those lost so many years ago, to all the descendants of those who suffered, to this community. That's why we're here, to shine a light, to make sure America knows the story in full. May 1921, formerly enslaved black people and their descendants were here in Tulsa, a boom town of oil and opportunity and a new frontier. On the north side, across the rail tracks that divided the city, already segregated by law, they built something of their own, worthy of their talent and their ambition. So in this passage, again, I'm going to stop after this paragraph, I think what comes across to me is this idea of community. Biden is acknowledging that the sense of community that was created at the time in this Greenwood district and that is still felt in those that are commemorating this event is important. And by acknowledging that, he's kind of not necessarily like welcomed himself into that community, because that would be inappropriate, but he's acknowledging that that is something that's important to them and that it's something he, as the writer, recognizes. So I won't read any further, but this is just kind of an example of values that Biden saw in the audience he was going to speak to. And I say Biden, guys, I know he has speechwriters who write things for him. But they acknowledge these values very intentionally in order to be that compassionate writer that people want from a leader of a country, and that this particular audience wants as it's gathered to really remember something awful that happened in the past. So just an example of how you can take the values you recognize in an audience to make your writing more compassionate and more thoughtful. The last thing to talk about is how we go about doing that, essentially. So when we're being a compassionate writer, it means that we're really paying attention to the values of the audience. But from there, we also got to figure out, how do I appeal to that value or that need, right? And there's 3 ways of doing that. These are called the rhetorical appeals. You might have seen them before, but I'll go over them briefly. Ethos is the ethical or moral appeal. But I also want to put the word character. Character, ethos, I should say, is derived from the Greek word for character. And so when we're talking about someone making or creating ethos in their writing, it's not just that they're talking about right and wrong. Sometimes it means that they're building their own credibility, that they're showing themselves to be a person of good character, or even holding up someone else as an example of good character. So I wanted to put that in there because that's part of ethos that I think can sometimes be overlooked a little bit. When we talk about pathos, then, we're talking about emotions. So anytime that they're appealing to an emotion. Now, to say that an author just appeals to emotion in general is way too vague, because there are so many different emotions that an author might be appealing to. So for example, in this speech, Biden was appealing to a sense of community, appealing to grief, appealing to disappointment. There's a lot of different emotions that he could have been picking out from his audience. And as long as they're kind of on that emotional spectrum, they would be an example of creating pathos. The last one, it's not logos, it's logos. And that's because it's talking about the logical appeal. So later in Biden's speech, he starts kind of breaking down the numbers of impact that the Greenwood district or Tulsa Massacre had, and that's more of the logical appeal, where you start bringing in specific facts and data. But I think that highlights a good point, that these are rarely used in isolation, and even in the part we read, I would say there's examples of ethos and pathos pretty clearly. So the task to think about now is reading through or recalling what we read in Biden's speech. What type of appeals is he using in order to reach out and appeal to the values of his particular audience?